The fastest way to lose your badge is to forget why you were given one. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, the Maple Street diner hummed with the familiar rhythm of small-town America. Coffee cups clinked against ceramic saucers, bacon sizzled on the grill, and a country song drifted softly from an old jukebox tucked into the corner. Waitresses moved from booth to booth with warm smiles, calling regulars by name while sunlight poured through the front windows, casting long golden reflections across the checkered floor. It looked like the kind of place where nothing remarkable ever happened, where strangers shared friendly nods and everyone expected another quiet breakfast before work. Then the front door opened, and everything changed. A woman in a navy blazer stepped inside carrying a simple leather briefcase that looked worn from years of travel. She wasn't surrounded by security, didn't arrive in a government SUV, and wore nothing that hinted at power or influence. She simply thanked the hostess with an easy smile and chose a booth near the window. Her name was Angela Carter, though no one in the diner recognized it. To everyone else, she was just another black woman stopping for breakfast before starting her day. She ordered scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, fresh fruit, and black coffee before quietly opening a folder filled with neatly organized documents. Every few minutes her phone vibrated across the table. She glanced at the screen, silenced the call without answering, and returned to reading. She never appeared rushed. She never looked nervous. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that real authority never needed to announce itself. Across the room, however, another pair of eyes had already formed a very different opinion. Officer Ethan Brooks stepped through the entrance wearing a freshly pressed uniform, exchanging greetings with a few locals who recognized him immediately. His polished badge caught the morning light as conversations briefly paused. Some smiled. Others nodded respectfully. Ethan had grown comfortable being the loudest source of authority in places like this. As he waited near the counter for his usual coffee, his attention drifted toward Angela. She sat alone, focused entirely on her papers, unaware that she had become the center of his attention. A customer leaned closer to Ethan and whispered something impossible for the rest of the diner to hear. Ethan's expression hardened almost instantly. Without asking another question, he turned and walked directly toward Angela's booth. The chatter inside the diner gradually faded as people sensed something unfolding. Forks stopped halfway to plates. A little girl coloring beside her grandmother quietly looked up. Angela slowly lifted her eyes from her paperwork as Ethan stopped beside the table. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I need you to step away from the booth." Angela looked at him calmly. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked in an even voice. "I'll explain outside," Ethan replied. "Stand up." She gently closed the folder and folded her hands together on the table. "May I know what this is about?" she asked politely. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You can answer questions after you cooperate." The room had become almost completely silent now. Several customers instinctively reached for their phones. The waitress who had served Angela only minutes earlier stood frozen near the coffee station, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. Angela never raised her voice. She never argued. She simply looked directly at Ethan and quietly said, "Officer, I hope you'll remember this morning very clearly." For a brief second, those words seemed to hang in the air, unnoticed by everyone except the young girl watching from across the room. Ethan mistook her calmness for defiance. Believing he was fully in control of the situation, he reached for his handcuffs as dozens of silent eyes followed every movement, unaware that one phone call, already trying to reach the woman sitting before him, was only minutes away from changing every life inside that diner. Angela Carter slowly rose from the booth without the slightest sign of panic. She carefully pushed her chair back beneath the table, picked up neither her coffee nor her briefcase, and calmly folded her hands in front of her. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Even the sizzling sound from the kitchen felt distant now, replaced by an uneasy silence that settled over every booth. Officer Ethan Brooks took another step closer, convinced he was handling an ordinary situation. To him, nothing about the woman standing before him deserved a second thought. She did not look frightened. She did not appear angry. If anything, Her composure irritated him even more. He believed people who had nothing to hide usually answered immediately. Angela simply looked at him with steady eyes that revealed neither fear nor resentment. The waitress who had served her breakfast only moments earlier quietly spoke from behind the counter. "Officer, she has been nothing but polite all morning." Ethan barely glanced in her direction. "Ma'am, this does not concern you," he answered before returning his attention to Angela. A businessman seated near the entrance cleared his throat and muttered that the officer probably knew what he was doing. Another customer slowly lowered his newspaper, uncertain whether to continue watching or pretend nothing unusual was happening. The little girl across the room whispered to her grandmother, "She does not look like she did anything wrong." Her grandmother gently squeezed her hand but offered no reply. Angela noticed the child for only a brief moment before returning her attention to Ethan. "Officer," she said quietly, "I would appreciate knowing why I am being detained." Ethan answered with complete confidence. "You match the description of someone involved in suspicious activity reported nearby." Angela nodded once. "May I ask what that description is?" Ethan hesitated for only a fraction of a second before saying, "That information can wait." His response sounded firm, yet several people exchanged uncertain glances. The explanation felt incomplete even to those who had instinctively trusted the uniform. Angela did not argue. She simply said, "I understand." Her phone vibrated again on the table beside the untouched coffee cup. The screen briefly illuminated with another incoming call before fading away unanswered. Ethan noticed it but ignored it completely. To him it was just another ringing phone. 2. Everyone else it was an interruption that somehow made the silence feel heavier. Outside, a black sedan slowly rolled past the diner before continuing down the street. No one inside paid attention except the elderly owner, Frank Dawson, who had operated Maple Street Diner for more than 30 years. He narrowed his eyes as though trying to remember where he had seen Angela before. Something about her face seemed familiar, but the memory refused to come. Angela turned slightly toward the counter. "Mr. Dawson," she said with a gentle smile, "I am sorry your breakfast rush has been interrupted." Frank blinked in surprise. He had never introduced himself. "Have we met before?" he asked instinctively. Angela smiled but never answered. Ethan interpreted the exchange as another attempt to distract from his investigation. "Enough conversation," he said. "Please place your hands where I can see them." Angela slowly extended her hands exactly as instructed. Not once did she resist. Not once did she raise her voice. The metallic click that followed echoed through the quiet diner with startling clarity. Several customers lowered their eyes. Others quietly continued recording with their phones. Angela remained perfectly composed as though she understood something no one else in the room could yet see. Then, resting on the table beside the untouched breakfast, her phone began ringing once again, and this time the name glowing across the screen caught the attention of someone standing only a few feet away. The bright screen remained lit for only a few seconds before fading back to black, but not before Frank Dawson caught a glimpse of the caller identification. His eyes widened ever so slightly, though he immediately questioned himself. Surely it could not be the same office he was thinking of. He leaned forward behind the register, adjusting his glasses as Angela's phone began vibrating once more across the polished wooden table. Ethan Brooks noticed Frank staring. "Something wrong?" he asked. Frank quickly shook his head. "Probably nothing," he replied, although his voice carried far less confidence than before. Angela stood quietly beside the booth, her expression unchanged. The metal restraints around her wrists did not alter the calm dignity with which she carried herself. She looked around the diner, making eye contact with several frightened customers, then offered a reassuring smile that somehow eased the tension without a single dramatic word. The little girl sitting with her grandmother smiled back. "Grandma," she whispered softly, "why is she trying to make everyone else feel better?" The older woman looked toward Angela with thoughtful eyes. "Sometimes the strongest people are the quietest," she answered. Ethan glanced toward the growing number of phones recording the encounter. He straightened his uniform and spoke louder, almost as if performing for the room. "Everything is under control. Please continue enjoying your breakfast." No one moved. Coffee grew cold. Plates remained untouched. Every eye stayed fixed on the woman standing peacefully beside the window. One customer quietly searched online using Angela's name after overhearing Frank softly repeat it to himself. Nothing appeared immediately because he had only heard her first name. He sighed and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across the diner, the waitress carefully approached Angela's table. "Your coffee is getting cold," she said gently. Angela smiled. "That happens sometimes. Can I warm it up for you?" the waitress asked almost instinctively before realizing the situation. Angela answered with the same calm voice she had used since the beginning. "Thank you. Perhaps later." Those two simple words somehow made the silence even heavier. Ethan reached for the leather briefcase resting on the booth seat. "Does this belong to you?" Angela nodded. "Yes, officer." "What is inside?" he asked. "Documents for a meeting scheduled this morning," she answered honestly. "May I see them?" Angela looked directly at him. "They contain official legislative materials. They should be handled according to proper procedure." Ethan interpreted her response as avoidance. "So you are refusing?" Angela slowly shook her head. "No. I am asking that proper procedure be followed." Her answer sounded measured, respectful, and precise. It frustrated Ethan because it gave him nothing to challenge. Frank watched the exchange with growing concern. The wording sounded familiar, almost identical to statements he had heard during televised committee hearings years earlier. Another vibration interrupted the silence. Angela's phone lit up again. This time the screen remained visible long enough for the waitress, Frank, and a young delivery driver near the entrance to read the caller identification. None of them spoke. They simply exchanged uncertain glances. The words displayed on the screen were impossible to ignore. Governor William Hayes. The phone continued ringing. Ethan barely looked at it before sliding it farther across the table with the back of his hand. "Whoever it is can wait," he said confidently. Angela lowered her eyes toward the phone for only a moment before looking back at him. "Some calls are more important than they appear," she said quietly. Ethan answered with a faint smile that revealed absolute certainty in his own judgment. "Not more important than police business." The ringing stopped. For a brief moment the diner fell completely silent once again. Then, less than 10 seconds later, the phone began ringing for the fourth time, and this time even Ethan could not ignore the name glowing across the screen. The fourth call echoed through the silent diner like the steady ticking of a clock counting down towards something no one could yet understand. Every vibration against the wooden tabletop seemed louder than the last. Ethan Brooks stared at the glowing screen for a moment before letting out a quiet sigh that suggested more annoyance than curiosity. Around him, the customers remained perfectly still. Even those who had quietly believed the officer was doing the right thing were beginning to wonder why someone identified as Governor William Hayes would continue calling the same woman over and over again. Ethan finally reached toward the phone, not to answer it, but to silence the ringing once more. Before his hand touched it, Angela spoke in the same calm voice she had maintained since the first moment he approached her table. "Officer, I respectfully recommend that you answer the call." Her words were neither emotional nor demanding. They sounded more like advice than a request. Ethan looked directly at her. "You do not tell me how to conduct my job," he replied. Angela simply nodded. "That decision is yours." Those 4 words settled heavily across the room. Frank Dawson quietly folded the dish towel in his hands. The waitress glanced toward the entrance, as though expecting someone to arrive at any second. Outside, another black sedan slowly parked across the street, followed moments later by a second vehicle that remained idling without anyone stepping out. No flashing lights appeared. No dramatic entrance followed. The cars simply waited. Inside the diner, a young delivery driver unlocked his phone and searched for recent news involving the governor's office. Within seconds he found an article describing a statewide economic development breakfast scheduled for that very morning. One sentence immediately caught his attention. The governor was expected to meet privately with State Senator Angela Carter before the event. The young man looked up at the woman standing quietly only a few yards away. Then he looked back at the photograph on his screen. His eyes widened. He compared the picture once more. The hairstyle was different. The clothing was simpler. But the smile was unmistakable. He slowly lowered his phone without saying a word. At nearly the same moment, Frank remembered exactly where he had seen her before. Months earlier, Angela had visited the diner during a community listening tour. She had spent nearly an hour speaking with veterans, teachers, and small business owners, refusing any special treatment. Frank remembered because she had personally thanked every employee before leaving. His face turned pale. He took one careful step toward Ethan. "Officer," he said quietly, "I think there may be a misunderstanding." Ethan barely turned his head. "Please stay back, sir." Frank hesitated. "I believe I know who she is," Ethan answered with complete confidence. "Her identity will be verified through normal procedure." Angela remained silent. She neither confirmed nor denied Frank's words. She simply stood with quiet patience, watching events unfold exactly as they were. The little girl looked at her grandmother once more. "If everyone keeps saying she is important," she whispered, "why is she the calmest person here?" Her grandmother smiled sadly. "Because people who truly know who they are usually do not have to convince anyone else." Then the phone rang again. This time the sound seemed to fill every corner of the diner. Ethan looked down one last time. The screen displayed the same name, unchanged, impossible to ignore. Governor William Hayes. Before anyone could speak, the front door opened softly, and a sharply dressed woman carrying a government identification badge stepped inside. She scanned the room only once before her eyes landed on Angela. Without hesitation, she walked forward and quietly asked a question that instantly drained every ounce of confidence from Ethan's face. "Senator Carter," she said respectfully, "has the governor been able to reach you yet?" Irene did not reach for the identification folder resting quietly inside her leather briefcase. She let it remain exactly where it was because this was never about proving who she was. It was about allowing everyone else to reveal who they truly were when they believed nobody important was watching. Across the courtroom, Officer Bradley leaned back with the confidence of a man who had never expected consequences to wear his own face. The prosecutor exchanged another satisfied glance with him, while several spectators whispered that the case had already been decided before the judge returned. Their certainty floated through the room like invisible smoke, settling over every bench and every polished wooden surface. Yet Irene simply folded her hands together, her breathing calm, her expression unreadable. Imagine sitting there while strangers decide your worth without knowing your story. Imagine hearing quiet laughter after every insult while resisting the temptation to defend yourself. That silence was not weakness. It was discipline. It was the patience of someone who understood that truth gained power when it arrived at exactly the right moment. She slowly turned her eyes toward the evidence table where every document had been arranged with almost theatrical precision. The photographs. The signed statements. The security reports. Everything looked complete. Everything looked convincing. But appearances had fooled people long before this courtroom existed. Hidden inside several of those files were details that no ordinary defendant could possibly have recognized. Tiny inconsistencies planted months earlier during an operation that had reached far beyond this courthouse. She noticed them immediately, yet she never reacted. That was exactly what she had been trained to do. Across the aisle, a young court clerk lowered his eyes after accidentally meeting her gaze. Something about her composure unsettled him. Most innocent people pleaded. Most frightened people argued. Irene did neither. She observed. She remembered. Every careless sentence. Every sarcastic smile. Every unnecessary display of authority. Nothing escaped her attention. Somewhere beyond the heavy courtroom doors, footsteps echoed through the hallway before fading once again into silence. The sound barely registered with anyone else, but Irene recognized the rhythm. Right on schedule. She glanced briefly toward the courtroom clock. The second hand continued its steady movement as though counting down towards something only she understood. Officer Bradley noticed the glance and laughed quietly beneath his breath. He believed she was finally becoming nervous. He believed the pressure was breaking her confidence. He had no idea she was measuring time, not fear. The judge adjusted several papers on the bench, preparing to resume the proceedings. His expression suggested impatience rather than curiosity. He wanted another routine conclusion, another file closed before lunch, another decision that would disappear into the endless archives of forgotten cases. But outside that room, events were already moving beyond his control. Telephones had begun ringing inside offices several floors above. Secure messages had reached people whose names never appeared on courthouse directories. Authorizations were quietly being confirmed while official vehicles rolled toward the building without flashing lights or dramatic sirens. None of it disturbed the ordinary rhythm inside the courtroom. The spectators continued whispering. Reporters prepared fresh pages inside their notebooks. The prosecutor organized his closing remarks with growing confidence. And Irene remained exactly where she was, her calm presence almost invisible beneath everyone else's assumptions. Sometimes justice never announces its arrival. Sometimes it walks through the front door without raising its voice. And sometimes the loudest people in the room are the last to realize that the balance of power has already begun to change. The courtroom doors opened with quiet precision before the judge could deliver another word. No dramatic announcement followed. No raised voices interrupted the silence. Instead, several men and women in dark business attire entered with measured confidence, each displaying official credentials only to the court officer's position near the entrance. Their calm professionalism changed the atmosphere more effectively than any shout ever could. Conversations stopped one by one until the only sound left was the slow ticking of the courtroom clock. Officer Bradley frowned for the first time that morning. He watched the newcomers exchange brief nods with the court administrator before one of them walked directly toward the judge's bench carrying a sealed folder marked with federal authorization. The judge accepted it with visible confusion. His confident posture softened as he opened the first page. He read one paragraph. Then another. The color slowly faded from his face. The prosecutor noticed the change immediately, but before he could ask a question, another official stepped toward him and quietly requested that he remain seated until the court received further instruction. Irene never moved. She simply watched the room catch up with the truths she had carried from the very beginning. Imagine standing in a room where every assumption begins collapsing one piece at a time. Imagine realizing that the person everyone dismissed had never been the one under investigation. The investigation had been watching everyone else. The courtroom suddenly felt smaller, not because its walls had changed, but because certainty had disappeared. 1. Federal representative finally spoke in a calm, respectful voice. He explained that ongoing federal oversight required immediate suspension of the current proceedings pending verification of evidence connected to a broader public integrity investigation. His words contained no anger, only careful precision. Yet each sentence landed with greater weight than the accusations that had filled the room earlier. Several spectators exchanged uneasy glances. Reporters quickly reached for their notebooks. The court clerk who had avoided Irene's eyes now looked at her with quiet disbelief. Officer Bradley attempted to speak, insisting that this had to be some misunderstanding, but nobody interrupted the federal representative. The authority in his voice came not from volume but from certainty. Then he turned toward Irene. For the first time that day, someone addressed her with the respect her position had always deserved. "Good morning, Director Hayes," he said. "We appreciate your patience." The words settled over the courtroom like complete silence after a storm. Every eye shifted toward Irene. She rose slowly from her chair, gathered her briefcase, and offered nothing more than a polite nod. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She had never come there seeking humiliation for anyone. She had come searching for truth. The judge stood instinctively, suddenly aware that the woman he believed was an ordinary defendant had been leading the confidential oversight operation connected to multiple federal agencies. The prosecutor lowered his eyes. Officer Bradley remained frozen, replaying every careless word he had spoken since morning. Irene looked around the courtroom one final time. Her voice remained calm, steady, and impossible to ignore. Respect for the law begins with respect for every person standing before it. The badge, the robe, and the title only have meaning when they protect fairness instead of replacing it. Nobody answered because nobody could. In that single moment, the courtroom finally understood that real authority had never needed to announce itself. It had been sitting quietly among them all along, allowing character to reveal itself before truth stepped into the light. No one rushed to leave the courtroom. It was as if every person inside understood that they had just witnessed something far greater than an ordinary hearing. The silence that followed carried more weight than every accusation spoken earlier that morning. Irene gathered the final document from the defense table and placed it neatly inside her briefcase before looking toward the federal representatives waiting beside the entrance. One of them handed her a secure tablet displaying the next phase of the investigation. She reviewed the information without urgency, then quietly confirmed that the remaining operations would continue according to schedule. The courtroom had never been the final destination. It had simply been the place where hidden patterns became impossible to ignore. Imagine believing a single moment of public humiliation was the whole story, only to discover it was merely one page inside a much larger investigation. That realization settled heavily over everyone watching. The prosecutor slowly removed his glasses and stared at the stack of evidence that only minutes earlier had seemed beyond question. Now every document demanded another look. Every signature required verification. Every conclusion suddenly carried doubt. The judge remained standing behind the bench, no longer protected by certainty. He realized that authority without careful judgment could become little more than habit wearing an official title. Officer Bradley finally lowered his eyes. For the first time that day, he was not thinking about procedures or appearances. He was replaying each assumption that had guided his decisions from the moment Irene entered the building. None of them had been based on facts. Every one of them had been built upon perception. That truth settled more heavily than any disciplinary action waiting outside the courtroom. Irene walked toward the center aisle before stopping beside the witness stand. She looked around the room with quiet compassion rather than triumph. Her voice remained calm enough that everyone leaned forward to hear every word. The purpose of accountability is not to humiliate people. It is to remind every institution that trust is earned one decision at a time. When respect disappears, justice begins to lose its foundation. Those words echoed through the courtroom with remarkable simplicity. Nobody argued because nobody could deny what had unfolded before their own eyes. One of the younger deputies quietly removed his badge from his uniform just long enough to look at its reflection in the polished metal. He seemed to understand that the symbol itself meant nothing without the character of the person wearing it. Nearby, the court clerk carefully organized the official record, making certain every federal instruction would be preserved exactly as received. Reporters stopped searching for dramatic headlines and instead focused on documenting the facts with unusual care. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds that had covered the city since morning, casting long beams across the courthouse steps where citizens continued moving through their ordinary lives, unaware that inside those walls an important lesson had quietly unfolded. Irene paused briefly before reaching the exit. She looked back only once, not at the people who had doubted her, but at the courtroom itself. Institutions could recover. Systems could improve. But only if the people inside them chose integrity over assumption. With that thought, she stepped through the doorway beside the federal team and disappeared into the bright afternoon, leaving behind neither celebration nor bitterness, only a room filled with people who would never again mistake calm dignity for weakness or quiet patience for the absence of power. The courthouse gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet nothing inside it truly felt ordinary anymore. Staff members resumed their duties with quieter voices, attorneys gathered their files with greater care, and deputies who had once hurried through the hallways now seemed more aware of every interaction they witnessed. News of the suspended proceedings spread quickly through official channels, but the confidential operation itself remained protected from public speculation. Irene preferred it that way. She had never measured success by headlines or public applause. The strongest investigations were often the ones that spoke the least while changing the most. Later that afternoon, inside a secure federal conference room several miles away, Irene sat across from senior oversight officials reviewing the results of an operation that had taken nearly 11 months to complete. Maps, timelines, interview summaries, and compliance reports covered the digital display along the wall. Every courthouse visit, every recorded observation, every procedural review had formed part of a much larger picture that reached across multiple jurisdictions. The courtroom had not been selected by chance. It had been identified through months of statistical analysis showing repeated procedural irregularities that deserved careful examination. Imagine carrying the weight of that responsibility while allowing people to underestimate you every single day. Imagine remaining calm because reacting too early could place the entire mission at risk. That quiet discipline had protected more than Irene's dignity. It had protected the integrity of every honest public servant waiting for the truth to surface. One senior investigator thanked her for maintaining complete professionalism despite the personal disrespect she had experienced throughout the assignment. Irene answered with the same steady composure that had defined every stage of the operation. She explained that accountability was never about proving someone wrong. It was about giving institutions the opportunity to become stronger by confronting uncomfortable truths. Several people around the table nodded in thoughtful agreement. They understood that lasting reform rarely began with dramatic speeches. More often, it began with someone refusing to abandon fairness even when fairness was not immediately returned. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, the judge remained alone inside his chambers after business hours had ended. The empty courtroom outside no longer echoed with arguments or whispered conversations. Instead, it held only silence and reflection. He reviewed his own notes from the hearing and recognized how easily routine had replaced careful observation. The realization was deeply uncomfortable, but necessary. Across town, Officer Bradley also sat quietly inside an administrative office completing required statements about the day's events. For the first time in many years, he examined not only what he had done but why he had done it. Every answer seemed to lead back to assumptions that had never deserved his confidence. Those reflections would not erase the morning, but they offered something equally important. They offered the possibility of change. As evening settled over the city, golden sunlight reflected across the courthouse windows before slowly fading into the calm colors of dusk. Irene stepped outside the federal building carrying the same leather briefcase she had carried into the courtroom that morning. It looked no different than before, yet inside it rested evidence that had already begun reshaping policies, restoring accountability, and strengthening public trust. She paused for a brief moment beneath the quiet evening sky before continuing toward her waiting vehicle. Another assignment would eventually begin. Another community would need patient oversight. Another room somewhere would mistake calm dignity for weakness. But experience had taught her one enduring truth. Character reveals itself long before authority ever needs to introduce itself, and real justice begins the moment people choose truth over assumption. Several months passed before the confidential investigation was formally concluded, yet its greatest impact could never be measured by reports, policy updates, or official memorandums. The real change appeared quietly inside everyday decisions made by people who had witnessed the truth unfold with their own eyes. New training standards emphasized impartial judgment. Internal review procedures became more transparent. Supervisors encouraged officers, attorneys, and court employees to question assumptions before accepting conclusions. None of those improvements carried Irene's name, and she never asked them to. Recognition had never been her destination. Responsibility had always been enough. One autumn morning she returned to the same courthouse, not as part of another investigation but as an invited guest for a professional ethics conference attended by judges, prosecutors, law enforcement leaders, and young public servants beginning their careers. The building looked exactly as it had before. The polished floors reflected the morning sunlight. The flag stood quietly beside the courtroom doors. The familiar wooden benches waited for another day of hearings. Yet the atmosphere felt unmistakably different. People greeted one another with greater patience. Conversations carried more respect. Small changes often become the strongest evidence that larger changes have truly taken root. Imagine walking back into a place where you were once underestimated and discovering that the greatest victory is not personal recognition but lasting improvement for everyone who comes after you. That was the feeling Irene carried as she stepped inside the conference room. Among the audience sat the same court clerk who had once avoided meeting her eyes. He now welcomed every visitor with equal courtesy. A few rows away sat Officer Bradley, no longer defined by the confidence that had once blinded him, but by a quieter willingness to listen before reaching conclusions. Growth rarely announces itself with applause. More often it reveals itself through humility. When Irene was invited to address the audience, she walked to the podium without notes. Her words were simple because the strongest lessons rarely require complicated language. She reminded everyone that every person entering a courtroom carries a story invisible to strangers. A uniform cannot reveal character. A title cannot replace integrity. A first impression cannot become a final judgment. Justice survives only when people remain willing to see one another as human beings before anything else. The room remained completely silent until she finished speaking. Then the applause arrived slowly, not as celebration for one individual but as recognition of a principle larger than everyone present. After the conference ended, Irene paused outside the courthouse steps beneath a clear blue sky. Families crossed the street together. Attorneys hurried toward afternoon meetings. Children laughed while waiting for the pedestrian signal to change. Life continued exactly as it always had, yet she smiled quietly because she understood something many people never discover. The greatest victories are often invisible. They live inside changed hearts, wiser decisions, and moments when ordinary people choose fairness over prejudice without anyone watching. She placed her briefcase inside her vehicle, looked once more toward the courthouse, and drove away toward another assignment waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. The building gradually disappeared in her rearview mirror, but the lesson remained clear. Real authority never demands respect through fear. Real justice never depends upon appearances. And the strongest measure of character is found in how we treat those whose true story we have not yet learned.